Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Well, Brooklyn and beyond, we're doing something a little different on this episode. We have invited folks from Seattle, Washington to come on to our show. And the reason was that, this lady, Lisa Richesson, has written what I think is a really provocative story. It's called White Lady, Black Sons. And we're going to be talking about what this book is about, what you learned in the process, and we're just going to get to know a lot more about you and your son, John. So why don't I introduce you both? You're Lisa Richesson. Yes. And John Bowles.
Hello.
And you're from Seattle, Washington. And thank you for coming out to Brooklyn.
Yeah,
we just
absolutely.
love having you here. In fact, you look Brooklyn.
Hey, I did that on purpose.
There you go. And then we have Mickey McCrillis and Phyllis Whitethorn. So Lisa, talk to us first about the title, White Lady, Black Sons. Why did you name the book that title?
Coming up with the title was probably the hardest part of writing the book. And I came up with all kinds of things. And then I realized that when I was in my 30s, I had a friend who was an artist, Linda Berry. She took a picture from my senior yearbook and painted it, put it in a show. I didn't know anything about it. I went down to the show to see it, and it was the last painting, and she called it White Lady.
Interesting.
And I just thought,
interesting.
Oh, okay, White Lady and Black Sons. That's what it's about.
Interesting, because when I first saw the title, I thought it was like one of these, experiences of raising black sons. And as I got deeper into the book, in fact, why don't you share with our viewers a little bit about what the book is about?
The book is a memoir, and it's about my experience in 1970, being an unwed teenager. And the baby had a black father. So I gave him up for adoption. I went on several years later and married the father anyway. I had my second son. The marriage was difficult, and through some very odd and providential circumstances, I found out where my adopted son was, and I waited until he was 18, and then I injected myself into his life, and then that's what it's about. Yeah.
Right, but it's about so much more than that, because in my reading of the book, there is a big story about physical and mental abuse.
Yes.
So why don't you talk to us about some of your experience managing that and dealing with what seemed to be a rather angry husband, knowing that color doesn't inform anger. You can be any color, and you can just be an angry person. But actually, before that, why don't we skip back into your upbringing, your relationship with your mother and father? Talk to us a little bit about that.
They were. I was an only child. They'd been married quite a long time by the time I was born. They were jazz lovers. They were sort of bon vivants. They liked to have sort of bohemian parties, and I came along. And shortly after that, my father embezzled some money from his job. And so the beautiful, wonderful life that they had as two people who grow up in poverty, in real poverty, they had attained a certain status in life where they had a lovely house, and, the things that are important to people who have grown up in poverty, and they lost that because of his embezzlement. So my mother became really a bitter person. And I guess because maybe I was convenient, I was made to be responsible for her happiness. Meanwhile, my father was, he was also very unhappy, and why they stayed together, I'm not really sure. But I was, sort of used to a family that fought all the time, and because I think of my mother's severe unhappiness, she did a lot to sort of squelch me. So I was never encouraged in any way by either of my parents.
There was a part in the book, and let you jump in as you want. There was a part in the book where when you were pregnant with your first son, and you were pretty much left on your own at, what was it, 17?
18.
18 to have this baby by yourself. Well, how did you manage something like that?
Well, first of all, I'm a very resilient person, and I knew from the get-go that I probably wasn't going to keep my child because I was ill-equipped to be a mother. At the time, my parents lived in Hawaii, and I tried to work. I lost 40 pounds in the first 4 months of pregnancy, and I knew that probably wasn't good.
Yeah, it's usually just the opposite, right?
Yeah, I should gain 40. Yeah. So my parents were in Hawaii at the time, and I wasn't working. I was going to be evicted from my apartment, and I called and said, I need to be with you for a while. So I flew over there, but before I even walked off the plane, my mother grabbed my arm and she said, if anybody asks you what's wrong with you, tell them you have a kidney infection. So I didn't know anybody in Hawaii. I mean, who was going to ask me what was wrong with me? But, that was what it was in her mind. She wanted to just, not deal with my pregnancy. So by the time I was about 7 months pregnant, I hadn't had any prenatal care. I was still losing weight. I was very anemic. And so I said to myself, you've got to take care of yourself. So I went back to Seattle and got on a women's and infant program at the University of Washington, and I had my child there. So
Seems like neglect, though. What do you think?
Well, when I was reading the book, Lisa, I a couple of times I had to put it down. I got so angry. One of the things that really got me upset was knowing through the whole book, I'm reading how you want to be a writer, and this is your dream, and then you get an opportunity. You get an opportunity for a 4-year scholarship to go to school, and this is your opportunity to, in my estimation, move away from all of this bad stuff that's happening towards what you really wanted. And then your mom steps in, she discourages you.
She said she didn't deserve it, and she accepted that. What was going on there? Right.
It's a long answer maybe, but I really felt that I was responsible for my mother's happiness. I mean, that was really sort of, grinded into me. And because of the extreme unhappiness that she had surrounding my pregnancy and the birth.
This was your way of making it up to her, kind of a thing?
Yeah, kind of, but and postpartum depression wasn't anything that was recognized back then, and so I didn't know. I just felt like I couldn't go on living. But the coincidence and the thing that really kicked it off for me was that I got myself together and I wanted to get an apartment again for my own. And of all the apartment buildings in Seattle, I moved into the one where the father was living. See, I'd gotten myself away from him, and it was very strange to see him standing in front of the elevator with a bag full of groceries saying, "What are you doing here?" I live here. I have just signed a lease. I guess I live here too. So he came back into my life, and he started that cycle of I'm really nice to you, I'm really awful to you. It's very confusing. And so one evening after he'd hit me a bit, I got really down. And I had pain pills from the hospital, and I called the crisis clinic and went to an inpatient institution for about a week.
Go ahead.
Just in hearing you, Lisa, and what Phyllis was saying about the intensity of the book, I think there were layers upon layers of a lot of emotional conflict. There's family dynamics, there's your own interpersonal, there's your mom, your parents as a couple, and certainly all that you went through, both your physical, postpartum, just very emotionally laden, serious issues that are brought to light through your story. One of the things, though, that I found interesting and that was recurring was, who were you really identified with? Because even just hearing you now talking about your mother, listening to some of the patterns that she lived and some of the behaviors on a clinical level, you also kind of took on a lot of her personality and her traits of enduring a bad relationship, of you know, of attracting, of staying in it and enduring, and because that was what at that time you were conditioned to know through her.
That's
So
right. That's exactly right.
it seems that as much as there were so many emotional issues and conflicts with your mother, that was who you identified with in moving forth with your life. Would you say?
How would Lisa have been able to break that? Because, you know, you've got that mother-daughter relationship. It's so intense.
Right.
How do you sever that negative piece?
That takes a lot of work first in identifying. I don't think Lisa at that time was cognizant of, I'm identified to my mother. That was her role model. That was the person. She was an only child, as she mentioned, certain things that were initiated, guilt, dealing with taking on the responsibility as an only child. She was the scapegoat, what they say in family therapy. So she took on all the family's problems and was the symptom bearer so that they could kind of maintain their solitude or solidity as
That's
a couple.
pretty heavy what you just said.
Yes, it is. And that happens quite a lot when you're looking at family dynamics. And so for Lisa to have just severed that and changed that, that would have been very difficult for a young girl going through a lot of her own emotional turmoil and still being in the midst of those family dynamics. So it takes a lot of work and intervention for that kind of a cycle to break.
Because I'm thinking about, you know, you spoke of your husband, Bob, and he was one angry guy.
Yeah.
How does one live with that?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think, you know, often we tend to marry or have a relationship with our parents, people who are like your parents. And, you know, one of the things I would ask my mother over the years is, why are you still married to this man? Obviously, you're miserable. And I never got, you know, an answer. Sometimes she would say, I feel sorry for him. Sometimes she would say, well, he brings home his paycheck. So
Those days that was important.
it was important,
Yeah, so to
especially
speak, right.
growing up in poverty like she and he both did. But in terms of breaking away from the kind of the hold that she had on me, I really didn't even think about it. It was just something I couldn't even think about. I had to make her happy. And in having this child, I made her very unhappy.
So that was like a get back in a way, huh?
Well, that's what I'm seeing, that even as you made her happy, there were times that you did things that made her totally unhappy. And you knew it. It was like there was a,
Well, I have to say I didn't get pregnant at 18 by a black man just to make my mother unhappy. But of course, that was one of the larger outcomes of it.
And you know, Tony, your question about how do you handle why do people stay in a rage or angry relationship? You know, codependencies get set up.
Talk to us about what that means.
Okay.
Right.
So that's two individuals that have become so dependent and so used to a cyclical pattern of behavior that that's what they know. And that's how they learn to live and function. And so when you take, even though it may be dysfunctional and unhealthy, that becomes their norm. That becomes the dependency. And that's very common in families, and especially in marital counseling and couples, sometimes even with siblings and sometimes with parents and children. So, you know, there was a codependency there. Lisa's mom and dad had their jive. That was what they were doing, and then.
And even though there's dysfunctional, you still can have these codependent relationships because you're in this partnership.
Comfortable. That's what they
This is what you know. So if you're
Yes.
miserable, you're comfortable because you can
Yes.
predict the miserable.
Yes.
That's true. What made the trend? Why did you turn? What was it that turned on in you and said, "Hey, I'm done with this abuse"? And then
my son, basically. My son, who had run away from home when he was 17 because he had his own abusive relationship with his father, called me. I didn't know where he was for 6 months. Maybe.
Now, how did that feel? Because I was like, how that would have made me completely crazy.
It did.
Not to know where the kid was,
It wrecked
you know?
me. It wrecked me.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It was like living in a nightmare. I was walking through a nightmare every day.
And you'd lost
every
one
night.
son, and now you lost, oh, good grief.
Yeah,
that could not have been
You know,
good.
how ironic is that? What was I supposed to learn from that experience? But yeah, he phoned me. I hadn't heard from him for a very long time, and he basically said, if you don't leave him, you're not my mother anymore.
Is it fresh with you, John, or is it way in the
No,
past?
it's still fresh.
Okay.
I try and keep it way in the past so I can move on with my life, but it's still fresh.
What about it? What about it? If
Well, you know, we grew up in a very abusive household, and it was scary. I was scared every day. You know, getting up in the morning, I didn't know what I was going to deal with. Coming home from school, I didn't know what I was going to deal with. What she was going to deal with. It was. I wouldn't wish that on anybody.
Did you ever jump in and try to protect your mother if you saw your father coming at her?
Sure, but then I would.
You weren't going to win.
Yeah,
Right? You
I
were
was not going to win at all, and I would pay for that. Not only would I pay for that with physical abuse, but he would make me come to his job. He was a janitor at a bowling alley at night. He'd wake me up at midnight, have me do all of his job, everything in that bowling alley until 5 in the morning, sneak me back home, and I was supposed to get up and go to school and perform in school and do sports. So I paid for it in many different ways. So when I finally got old enough, it was really a matter of, if I don't leave, I'm going to kill him or he's going to kill me. And I need to get out. I was telling her, you know, you make enough money, you need to get out. Whatever, she didn't at the time, so I did. And I wanted to stay away. I wanted to try and break away from that myself, and hopefully teach her a lesson to say, hey, if I can do it at 17 and I don't have a job, I'm on the streets trying to stay in school, then you can do it. So when I finally called her, I was letting her know, this is what you need to do, because she was my mom. I love her now, I loved her to death, and I wanted her away from this horrible abuse. Even though he was my father, I knew it wasn't right. It wasn't healthy. And even at that young of an age, I was like, I got to do something. And that's the only thing that I could think of doing.
How did you break that cycle of abuse? Because oftentimes with abuse, you just take that to the next relationship. How did you heal from being parented that way?
I'll tell you how I made a choice. I realized that you always have a choice. You can choose to make excuses and continue to do the abuse, because I guess that's the easy way, or you can choose not to. And it's extremely difficult, as she probably will say, to make that choice, but that's the choice I wanted to make. I didn't want to be that type of a person. I didn't want to be that to my future wife, and I definitely didn't want to bring that to my future children, because that is not in any way, in my opinion, how you parent and how you love and how you raise and how you educate your children.
So did you go to counseling? What was your window out of this?
I did go to counseling. A lot of counseling on my own. That helped a tremendous amount. But more importantly than that, it was just, like I said, I made that internal decision that I'm not going to go that way. And I'm not the most religious person, but I have a great relationship with God, and God has always looked out for me, has always guided me. As long as you listen, He'll guide you, in my opinion.
Right.
And that helped me make those choices. And I've actually talked to a lot of people about this to try and help them, to say, hey, you don't need to go down this road. I know what you're going through. You don't need to do the drugs. You don't need to get in the gangs. This is when I was younger, when I was out there. You don't need to do these things.
You were into the gang life a bit?
I wasn't, but
Okay,
when I was in the streets, I had that thrown at me.
Right.
About drugs and gangs and this and that. And I was like, nope, I'm not going that way. I don't have to go that way. I'm going this way. Was this way difficult? Whoo! Yes.
So you were a runaway for a period of time, just living on the streets,
Yes.
basically?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
How long was that?
A year.
At least a year. Yeah, a little over a year. Yeah. And then a friend's dad finally took me in, which that was an interesting story how that worked out. But so I can finish school and get out of the street life. But yeah, very difficult. But I'm glad I did it. It's definitely made me who I am today.
John, when you decided to leave, because you went back, and it's an interesting point, and I think, Tony, you had asked on it. When you decided to leave, what was that initial decision? What was that? Were you frustrated? Were you desperate? Were you ready to go?
Yeah, I was scared. I was just scared, and I was sick and tired of the abuse. sick and tired of being hit every day for no reason at all, sick and tired for doing his job, sick and tired of the way he was treating my mom, just sick and tired. And that was it. And that was it for me, and I left.
You know, a father, you know, is supposed to be that loving relationship. So, you know, we talked yesterday when we went out to dinner, I might as well reveal that. And we talked about, did you, you know, were you able to love this person?
It's a great question. And the honest answer is yes and no. And it's really hard to explain. He's my dad. And I think as a child, you always want love and approval from your parents, even when they're treating you like the way we were treated. So the way I am, the way I'm wired, I still had some kind of love for this person, but I certainly didn't like him, and I certainly couldn't be around him at all based on his behavior. So, but it was very tough for me. I went through a lot of emotional roller coasters on that one.
Now, you know, there were some highs in your book. You found your adopted son. Talk about that.
Well, it's a long story, but in the process of finding an adoption agency who would work with me, I just kept hitting, you know, brick walls, because when we would say, well, the father's black, they would show me the door. So I finally found one that was being funded by the U.S. government specifically to place, you know, special children in adoption, and that was the Medina Children's Services. So I worked with them. You know, I then went on and had John, and I had to go back to work, and I got a job at Planned Parenthood in their research department, and because they didn't have enough room in the clinic, they rented spaces in a building where Medina Children's Services was, okay? So because at the time it was such a horrible, horrible thing, something I had to be ashamed of and, you know, secretive about, I just stayed. They had the whole first floor, and I just stayed away from that area. I just went in the door, up the stairs, went to my office, and, you know, minded my own business. But one morning I came to work, and someone had broken in the building. And there was, you know, stuff everywhere, and it was kind of a big deal, and the police came. And then maybe about a month after that, I was working late in my office. I heard a noise from downstairs. I thought, I'm not going to sit up here and, you know, get whatever. So I grabbed a broom, because that's what you do. You sweep people, right? And I went down into that area, and there wasn't anybody there. But I saw this door, and I thought, well, I'm going to check in there in case, you know, there's someone in there. And I opened the door, and it was the file room. And it hit me, you know. I just stood there and I thought, oh my God, you know.
This right is presenting itself to
Exactly. It was like,
Right.
you know, here's your plate. So I, you know, rightly or wrongly, went up to a file cabinet. It was a cabinet for the 3x5 cards. And I opened it up, and I plunged my hand in, and I pulled up a card, and it was mine.
See, look at that. Oh.
I know. So, and I stood there, obviously, in a bit of shock, and I didn't know what to do. I felt, on the one hand, I felt, you know, like I had breached the confidentiality and this, you know, and his, you know, his life. And then on the other hand, it's like, oh my God, I know where my child lives. I know who adopted him. I know what they do. I know their names. And I just wrote everything down and put the card back in place, and then, you know, I went home. Kept that a secret, obviously, for a long time, and it was very difficult. And I think most birth mothers, for instance, celebrate, or not, you know, anti-celebrate the birthdays and the holidays that come up where your child isn't with you. For me, it was, you know, even worse, because I knew where he was, you know, I knew who he was. And then when he was 7, his father, who was a teacher and a jazz musician in Seattle, passed away. And ironically, it was on the same floor of the hospital where I worked. And, you know, so then I knew he was fatherless, but not really. He had his birth father. But I had to respect his adopted mother's role, and I just, you know, kept a little profile, as it were.
But you were allowed to re-engage.
Yeah, but not in the normal way, you know. So as his 18th birthday was approaching, I took about, 3-4 hours out of a Saturday afternoon and called her. And that was a difficult conversation at first, but I had no intention whatsoever of usurping her role or pushing myself into their lives. I just said, I want you to know we're here, and we talked a lot, and it ended up being lovely. She told me about Fred, I told her about John, and we agreed that when Fred turned 18, she would tell him about us, and then that was it. That would be it. From that point, it would be like, okay, Fred, now you know, you can do whatever you want with this information. However, just to, I don't know, just to hedge my bets a little bit, I sent her a card just before his birthday, and I put a picture of John in the card. So I sent that to her, and she called me and she said, well, I'm taking Fred to Pullman, which is on Eastern Washington College. Get him registered for college. On the way back, I will tell him. Okay, so that evening, Sunday evening, the phone rang, and it was him.
See, that was like a real high point for me in this book, because the idea that it just seemed so providential. I mean, how do things like this happen? And then to have a birth mother that was, an adopted mother who was was receptive to your being in his life. I thought that was really amazing.
Yeah, it didn't happen immediately. I mean, we talked a lot, she and I. But I was, really was sincere that I didn't want to, run in and mess up their lives.
Well, this is all the time we're going to have for this part of our two-part episode on White Lady, Black Sons. But we will see you next time. So please tune in to part 2 of White Lady, Black Sons.